If you want to make hard techno in Ableton Live, then this tutorial right here is exactly what you need, because I'm going to break down step by step the sound design and mixing techniques used by some of the most respected hard techno artists. I'm talking about producers like Alignment, Klangkünstler, Kobosil, just to name a few. So let's dive right in. Here is what we're going to create. So this could be a hard techno song idea in the style of Alignment, Kobosil, Klangkünstler. I've actually meshed together some of the individual characteristics of these artists, so this is not a sound-alike of just one particular artist. And by the way, if you struggle with finishing songs, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. It's just my 3 simple steps that will help you finish at least one great sounding song per month. Get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. Now let me walk you through all the individual elements of this session. So producing hard techno is all about finding the perfect balance between distortion, aggression, fast grooves on the one hand, and emotion, punch, depth, and musical storytelling on the other hand. This is why artists like Alignment, Kobosil, or Klangkünstler are so successful right now, because they manage to find that balance and they have tuned it perfectly. Hard techno can also be quite challenging from a mixing and mastering point of view. So in my role as a mixing and mastering engineer, I get sent tracks from time to time that are so distorted that they almost are unplayable on club and festival systems. Because if there's too much distortion and saturation going on, what it essentially means is that they are so compressed and have so little dynamics that the speakers don't really move anymore, which is obviously a bad thing in the club. So my goal here is to give you a look behind the scenes on how you have to set up a session that on the one hand feels super distorted and aggressive, and on the other hand is very, very loud, still very punchy and emotional. Let's start with the kick drum. So as you can see, we have a kick group that consists of 2 different kick drums, the punch and the character layer. I've made a specific video talking about that topic and how to choose these layers, how to mix them together. You can check it out right here. I'm going to show you what these layers sound like in this case. Now, as you can tell, they are super, super different, and there's a reason for that. The punch layer delivers that initial foundation, the thing that moves the speaker, and the character layer gives us the edge and the aggression that we want. If you only have the aggression layer, it's almost sounding a little bit too flat in my opinion, and I can already tell you that on club systems this will be a problem. But if you have both of them together in this group, it sounds like this. Now, since we are in hard techno, to me the sound's still a little bit too clean. So we can go to the group that groups together the kick punch and kick character and add a little bit of saturation. I will play it without and then with. Now, as you can hear, this is at the edge of breaking apart, but it still does not take away from the initial punch. The reason I achieved this with the saturator is because I've dialed in a couple of settings that are important to look at. So as you can see, I chose the hard curve here, and I added a ton of drive and made up for like a little bit on the output, bringing this down, and only 7% on the dry wet, which means like I'm only adding about 7 to 8% in of this. The interesting thing here is that I've skewed the frequency towards the high end, and this is also where you can dial in the perfect blend basically. If I want to keep the foundation of the kick still solid and punchy, I will dial in something like this. If I want to distort the very low end of the kick, I would go a little bit down. So listen to what happens when I change these settings. This also sounds quite cool, but the problem is that to me it distorts too much of the fundamentals of this kick drum. So when I bring this back up, I only get a little bit of extra edge on the top end of the kick. So the width and the depth sometimes do a little bit more, especially on the lower frequencies. But to me, this is the setting that works best in this case. And obviously with wet dry, you can blend in the perfect amount. So I would not go higher than this, otherwise it's just breaking apart and getting so distorted that the kick just doesn't cut through anymore. Now, since I've used very nice samples on the kick punch and kick character layer, I don't need any additional compression. I used a touch of limiting here, which just helps to solidify this and give it a bit more punch. Limiting can be great on individual channels. You don't use a limiter always just on the master bus. I really like limiters to add a little bit of color. The Ableton Live limiter is not my favorite one, but here I stuck mainly with Ableton Live plugins to show you that this is totally achievable with the stock tools. So listen to this without and with. It's not perfectly gain matched. By the way, I also have a video on this, which you can see somewhere on top here. The thing about the Ableton limiter is that this auto setting sometimes doesn't do a great job. So I would always deactivate this. 8 milliseconds, something like that should be fast enough. And if you just have a little bit of gain reduction, 3 dB-ish, then I think you're good to go. Now let's move on to the bass channels, because the kick alone is only 50% of the low end. The bass group consists of 4 different layers, and I'm going to walk you through each one of them. The first bass layer we have here is a rumble, super deep sub rumble. And by the way, I've made also a video about techno rumbles, which you can watch here. The sub rumble without anything sounds like this. It's just a reverse kick drum. And then I have this chain here from hybrid reverb, saturator, auto filter, a little bit of EQ8, and an LFO tool that takes a little bit away from the beginning. This is how all of this sounds together. So the hybrid reverb creates this like spaciousness. The saturator adds a little bit of crunch and smear on top of that. And the auto filter just takes away the top end. So kind of bring in the effects one by one. And I'm also going to be playing this together with the kick drum. I think this makes a lot of sense for you to listen to both. Now on the bass group, I also have a little bit of glue compressor that is sidechained by the kick drum. So this also adds to the groove. So the LFO tool doesn't do all the heavy lifting alone. What you can notice is that this is so perfectly dialed in that kick and bass are never getting in the way of each other. And by the way, the reverb is relatively long to my taste. I think we could also shrink this down and make it shorter, but I kind of like it because in the overall context of the whole music, it just floods the low end a little bit without making it muddy, so I just thought it works. On many other cases, I would maybe shorten the reverb a little bit so that it's not as smeary. On top of that rumble layer, we have a bass center and a bass side layer. So the reason I've split those two apart is because I wanted to have something that is like the octave above the rumble for sure and creates a little bit of a solid foundation for the track. And then the bass sides layer is adding a little bit of the edge and character. So you always see this same principle going. I have something that provides the stability and another element that provides the character. Now let me solo this. Alone, it sounds pretty boring. And with this, on its own, it almost sounds too plasticky, but in the overall context of the song, it works really well. Let me just play all of it together. And this is because we have designed the bass layers to fit together like puzzle pieces perfectly. And this is why this whole track can be so loud. So here is a quick walkthrough how I created these. I used wavetable synthesis for both of these layers, the center and the side. The center layer is basically more or less a square shape and a sawtooth shape oscillator, both playing together. And I also added a little bit of the sub here. There's not too much going on, to be honest. The only modulation that's happening here, it's a little bit of envelope that opens up this filter, and that's about it in terms of modulation here. So I also have a saturator put onto this. Now, as you can tell, it adds a little bit of that grittiness, but again, I've dialed it in a certain way that keeps some of that original stability. Now, the sides layer is really interesting. The sides layer is consisting of two very different types of wavetables. The wavetables that I chose here sound like this. So I have this brutal metal and clipped sweep here. Both of them are distortion, and I also filtered out the low end. So without this filter, it sounds like this. but I wanted to just get this perfect grittiness, and you can achieve this by filtering out the low end and then dialing a little bit in the resonance here. Now here this is also a tiny bit modulated, not too much. The envelope 2 controls once again the filter. And the only reason I do this is to create a little bit of texture and movement in the sound. I'm not going super crazy because all of the bass sounds are designed to provide that stability. This one is just there to open the bass up to the sides without flooding the stereo spectrum in the very low end, because the low end is still pretty centered from this bass center sound. I also have a little bit of saturator going on here. Now this is a pretty extreme setting here, but I did it intentionally because this is what this sound is supposed to do. But it's the same pattern that repeats. I combine super edgy sounds with more stable sounds, and then together it creates the secret sauce of why this track sounds so powerful. All right, let's go into the last layer here. And this is something that I see Kobosil and Klangkünstler do a lot. Not so much in the alignment tracks, but this is a rolling bass line. Sounds like this. Which, to be honest, like, it sounds kind of retro, which is very nice. The shapes I've used here is just sawtooth and a slightly different sawtooth. You can see they are slightly detuned here. I also used a little bit of sub oscillator in here. And there's a lot of filter movement going on. So the amp envelope is basically controlling the filter opening here. And I've used the OSR filter with a little bit of drive and pretty aggressive resonance, 44%. I've also used an LFO tool to duck this behind the kick a tiny bit. And a little bit of saturation to give it extra crunch. Without the saturator, it sounds like this. And this to me sounds a bit too retro. To make it more hard techno sounding, added a little bit of saturator, this time in analog clip mode, because I didn't want this element to be very saturated, just a tiny bit of crunch. The interesting thing about the bass is that there's actually a longer sequence playing. We have a pretty long sequence of 3 different notes, and this is creating the harmonic foundation. Once again, this trick is more coming from the Kobosil and Klangkünstler tunes, because both of them create this like very emotive, almost retro sounding hard techno. But it also makes sense in this context where I used a lot of the other elements from the alignment tracks. So super short notes, just making sure that everything fits into the spectrum with this really hard groove, because with 150 BPM, if your notes are too long, everything is just going to be swamped with sounds. So now our low end is in place. We have a stable and punchy, but also super aggressive and distorted low end going on. We can now build on top of this. Make sure to pay close attention now and also watch the video till the end, because I'm going to walk you through how to create not only the drum tops, but also a screechy, super aggressive lead sound that has a lot of movement, a lot of emotion going on, and you can recreate this easily with just Ableton Live stock tools. Before we get there, if you got any value out of this video so far, then consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. This really helps me on my journey as someone who makes videos on the sides while running a studio, and also it helps you because the YouTube algorithm will suggest more great videos like this one to you. So here's what the drum tops group sounds like. It just consists of 3 elements: the shaker, the hi-hat, and the claps. And we're now going to talk about each one of them briefly. So here's what the shaker sounds in solo. And the secret weapon here is this erosion plugin in combination with the LFO, because without those 2 tools, it sounds like this. And this is very cool because I've put the erosion in white noise mode, relatively wide setting, so it's infusing this band of noise. And I've used an LFO, a really slow LFO, and mapped it to the frequency. And this is why this is moving according to the speed of the LFO. And I've tuned the offset and the depth in so that it's just moving on kind of the upper part of the frequency spectrum, so from 3 kilohertz to 20. Very nice texture. I think this works perfectly in the context of hard techno. Now let's look at the hi-hat. I did nothing crazy to the hi-hat. I just picked a sample that sounds like the thing that I want to have here. So you want a hi-hat sample that cuts through, that has a nice transient at the beginning of the sound, but also isn't too clean. I didn't extra distort this because I think it's really important to be purposeful with your distortion. So some elements in a hard techno track need to be super distorted, but other elements need to stay a little bit more clean. I want the hi-hat to cut through and provide a little bit of that extra snap. Now together with the shaker, it sounds like this. And then you can obviously add in the clap, which sounds like this. And also here, not much going on, a little bit of compression and limiting. Without this, it sounds like this. So the type of clap sample that you want to use for hard techno tracks, you want to use something that is not too high pitched, has a little bit more stability, a little bit more low end in there, has a bit of crunch and texture to it, but if it's too distorted, then you're kind of missing this backbeat in the whole groove. So I always go for samples that are kind of bright, but still have a lot of stability. And so you can enhance this by adding a little bit of compression. And by the way, I used parallel compression here, 53% wet dry setting. I did a video about parallel compression if you don't know what this is. Just a tiny bit of extra snap, and the same with the limiter. All of this together just helps the percussions cut through a tiny bit more. There is also a reverb send. So I have a little bit of hybrid reverb with an early reflection setting and a small ambience. This is just designed in a way that lets the reverb be non-intrusive. So if I mute the reverb and then I bring it in, the room is not flooded with reverb. So with and without again. Just a tiny sense of depth that is being added to this. Now let's finally talk about our lead synth here. It sounds like this in solo. So as you can see, the scale that I've used here is D sharp or E flat minor. And there's like a lot of really fast 16th notes. And the pattern overall is a little bit of a call and response pattern. Nothing crazy going on, but the interesting thing happens in the sound design. Let's look at the chain here, and don't get overwhelmed. I'm going to walk you through this step by step. So the foundation of the sound is a wavetable patch that is quite interesting. I've used a lot of formant sounds. So formants are these like vowel sounds. And on the other layer, I used a noise sound that also kind of has a lot of vowels in there. A little bit of cross modulation with FM, as you can see here. And here in the modulation matrix, there's much more happening compared to the bass sounds. And this is intentional because the lead sounds in hard techno are the, I would say, most modulated elements in the whole setup. So what does the modulation do? It changes the wavetable position here. It also modulates the filter cutoff. But then also I did something like the FM amount and the filter frequency is being modulated by an envelope. I also used a little bit of pitch drift, or like a pitch envelope, which basically means that this envelope 3 here, it's a really sharp one, changes the pitch of the sound. Like, so the sound is sliding in. And this is what creates more of that almost like screechy synth sound. And then obviously I used a lot of unison overall. So the sound is detuned and spread out a little bit. The shimmer mode is fantastic. This is what this patch sounds like without the following effects. So you kind of have this like trancey hard style vibe, but it's obviously way too clean and almost like EDM sounding and wouldn't fit at all into a hard techno sound. But if you add the vocoder in, it sounds like this. So I kept it in noise setting. The cool thing here is that you can dial in the exact amount of distortion that you want by using these formant, dry wet, and depth parameters. So let me just play around with this so you get an idea of what's possible. So if you want it to be more screechy, add in more of the formant in the positive direction. If you want it to be more low-end focused, bring it back. I kept it on a setting like this. The depth is obviously like how much of that noise is being brought into the sound. But you could also just create percussive sounds, and a lot of hard techno leads are just percussive sounds. So you can decide on how tonal you want the whole thing to be. I think for the context of this, which is kind of a blend between the Kobosil, Klangkünstler and alignment sounds, I think here it's really nice to bring in a little bit of that melodic side. The saturator on top of this is optional. But I think it just helps add a little bit of that edge. Now the EQ8 just takes off a little bit of the super low end here. I want to keep this clean for the bass sounds, and I added a tiny bit of extra edge in the upper mid range and a little bit of echo just to help with spreading it out a tiny bit. It's a really, really quick echo. You don't hear a lot of stuff ringing out. I intentionally did not use any reverb on top of that because I didn't want to flood the frequency spectrum with even more information. If you have super fast percussions and then also the screechy lead sound, you don't want to add even more sauce to this because then it starts to get undefined and messy. Now, let's listen to all of this in context. So it's really interesting. As you can see, there are some really heavy resonances here, and it would be super stupid to go in with Soothe or a dynamic EQ and notch out these resonances because they make up part of that very aggressive formant sound, the vocoded sound of the leads. You could also see that there's like a super heavy low end going on and a little bit of a smiley curve in the frequency spectrum. And this is very typical for these hard techno tracks. This would leave space, for example, for in some parts bringing in a melodic pad or sometimes infusing it with a little bit of vocals. So this would be the area where these things can take place. This is where we add a little bit of warmth again. In terms of loudness, we are at -8 LUFS. And the fascinating thing is, I mean, for mastering purposes, I don't really like the Ableton limiter. But here's what the Pro L is doing. So we are at -8 LUFS and I'm only taking away less than 3 dB, which is insane. I could even push this to -6 or higher without like too many artifacts. We are at like -5 or something now, which is absolutely crazy. I would not go that far, but it shows you if all of the pieces fit together well, then you can achieve insane levels of loudness. Now, it gets a little bit too crunchy for my taste when I push it that loud, but theoretically you could dial in some of the individual distortions on the channels and then use a little bit of that final limiter distortion to get there. And bear in mind, this is not even like properly mixed and mastered. If I use like a little bit more of a complex mastering chain, and by the way, if you want something like this, then leave a comment below so I know that you want this type of video, then you can get even more level out of this and even more clarity if you work the master channel a tiny bit. So that is it for this video. I hope you got a ton of value from it. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. If you got anything out of this, I want to hear from you. I also happily answer all of your questions. So make sure to drop a comment below and I will see you in the next video.